maybe that's a good place to demonstrate the rendering then. Refining this area maybe. So our main tools for this phase of the drawing, rendering of the lights, will be the kneaded eraser, 2H pencil or any hard pencil you have, and of course the sharper mono zero eraser. But mostly we will be using the kneaded eraser and the pencil. And in this stage especially, we're gonna start using a lot of this mol stick. So the first thing we do in the rendering stage is we pick an area. Let's say I pick this one. I think I'll try to sort of speed run this rendering stage. As I said in a previous section, a good rule of thumb is that the rendering stage takes at least as long as, the previous stages together. But usually it takes even more if you push it to a really fine finish. So for like a painting, for example, I might have taken 3 weeks to set everything up for the rendering stage, and then 4 more weeks for actually second painting, which is equivalent of the rendering stage in art terminology. So yeah, we just want to try to look for any tones that need, adjusting, let's say. The goal of this stage really is to just make things look more refined and make the transitions work from tone to tone. This area isn't paper white, so I can actually just kind of hatch it a little bit darker, and that always that already makes it a little bit softer as a form, because the contrast is less between this darker tone here and the sort of light area next to it. Let's actually work a little bit on this line. Maybe that's actually a line that we'll use the HB pencil for, because it's darker. We don't have to press as much. What I'm doing here is I'm just slightly, putting tone next to it, so it's a little bit softer on the side where it's part of the turning form and not an overlapping thing in front of another form. If the upper or left edge is a bit sharper and this right edge towards this trapezius form is a little bit softer, that'll already create the illusion that it's part of the form, not just some random line in the middle of it. But of course we can just go in there and actually make a little bit of a transition. What we see here is a little bit more linear, I think, but we'll just turn it into a form so kind of fits with our agenda. Okay, that's better. So this stage is mostly about very minuscule detail work. Can be a little bit tedious, and but also, like, some people, myself included, actually love rendering. When you get over the fact that it takes a long time, it's super relaxing to see, the result just kind of appear and take its final form. It's nice to see the fruits of your labor sort of really take shape. What we mostly use the eraser for is this very kind of sharp point to really refine shapes and pick out any dark spots that we don't like. So yeah, we just kind of work the transitions between tones. That is essentially what rendering kind of means, I suppose. I haven't looked up the definition, but there's the digital rendering word, which refers to rendering a scene in a 3D program or a video editing software, where it refers to actually creating the final product from the editor. So, but here we are talking about actually the in-betweens of the tones, let's say. Because the planes of light stage, our goal isn't to make nice soft transitions. You can see here maybe there is a pretty distinct line between this paper tone and this darker plane. Same here. We're here to sort of get rid of those. And anything that's soft on here, we should make soft on here. So there's a little bit of white wider spotches, well, lighter spotches next to this tone, so I'll just tackle those a little bit. Soften them out a little bit. So this is really subtle stuff, you know. And one trick to make the form turn a little bit better is to always think of making it softer towards the light source. That'll create the feeling of sort of roundness as well. Especially useful when you have a lot of like small forms next to each other. I had a Bargue drawing, the third one. It was of a standing man with some hair, and the hair were super small forms, you know, in the area around the size of this area I'm working on currently, and there's quite a few of those. So the way you can make those very small, very subtle forms turn, just soften them towards the light more than you have it towards the sort of darker edge. So let's just darken a little bit here. In a way, hatching with a harder pencil, you can also sort of blend things together as well. You can smooth things out because it doesn't leave too much of a tone, but kind of evens out it a little bit more. So it's already looking kind of nice and smooth over here. We're not gonna take this to the, you know, smoothest possible finish. You know, I went over the facts of this project that I have time limitations. I want to actually be painting my own paintings too, you know. But you know, I want to spend this time to give art lessons to the world a little bit. So, but that said, there's a way to really refine this. It's probably not something the camera picks up. I actually have a video on YouTube where I do this dot picking technique in charcoal, where you just kind of color in all these small paper texture squigglies to the same tone as they're surrounded with, and then also you pick out any darker spots with the needed eraser. And that's why this tip is important. We see maybe here, for example, there is a little darker mark. That's something we would, you know, be picking up. And I will be doing this, you know. Here's some darker marks next to the halftones, so not very clean. Let's take those out. And the more you stare at the paper texture here, the more you'll start noticing those little imperfections, and the more you have to work. So really, that's how you can spend 3 hours on an area like this. You really get picky with it. So I'm kind of purposely avoiding going to that finish level because it's just so time consuming. But you can try it out. That's how we did every project. Basically, we tried to finish it as, you know, as tight as we could in school. And I feel like that sort of gave us the option then in the future to decide what kind of finish we're working with. You know, because we're capable of finishing something to a very high level of refinement, of rendering, as opposed to, you know, if you learned in school to just not take things that far, it's way harder, I feel like, to learn to tighten up afterwards. And because, you know, it's really an extra step of like observation and attention to the work, as opposed to, I feel you can always leave things a bit looser, because that's more like the early stages of painting, for example, where we do the planes of light, just leaving in the brush strokes, kind of very shapy and sharp edged on top of the big form modeling. But yeah, so it's kind of easier to loosen up than to tighten afterwards. That's my theory, at least. Might not be the case, as I've maybe noticed, you know. That's the theory, let's say, because in actuality, when you're working on a project afterwards, I feel this kind of tight rendering can also be a bit of a crutch. You know, it's a safety net. When in doubt, just render it out. And maybe you don't want it to look very rendered. Maybe you want it to be, you know, loose and airy and expressive. I love art like that, but I've had a bit of issues personally, you know, loosening up after this school. So that's me, you know, telling you two different things in the same discussion here. But I think the fact stays, you know, it's easier to learn to tighten up first and then, you know, let go and loosen. Okay, I'm doing the thing now which I'm telling you to avoid, which is, you know, my teacher called it spring cleaning, a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit there. We should actually just try to finish an area and then move on. So that way we know we don't have to come back to it and sort of second guess that area. We can just really move on. So yeah, I guess I should go over a little bit on just how does one render. Like, you just basically start softening the edges of each shape with this very light tone, and you know, might be you. Well, first you kind of want to make sure the tone generally is of the right value, so you don't have to sort of hatch all over the place all the time. Once you have the tone in place, then you start working the transition. That would be the ideal scenario, sort of. So that's sort of what we aim for, let's say, because, you know, in painting we don't want to, you know, we can't just hatch over to make it slightly darker. We have to mix the exact color we want and then, you know, move from there to softening the transitions. We can't, you know, make a darker tone or a lighter tone in place of the correct one and then sort of nudge it around with a pencil. We would have to, you know, remix the tone, perhaps even scrape off the previous mark and then lay it correct. So that's sort of what we're already practicing here. Trying to lay the correct tone with these tools in the right shape, in the right place, and that stands with the rest of the projects as well. I know it's not, you know, super natural feeling with the pencil to sort of work in this way, because the pencil's advantage really is that it's quite malleable. You know, you can just take things off and put things on and all this kind of stuff. And while we're at it, we're just gonna, you know, fix things that we see are not correct. Maybe this line here is just a little bit more tilted towards the left there, so. Okay, so here you can see the kind of thing I was talking about before. At some point, we made this tone near the edge with the stump, but, you know, there's a dark line, then there's a lighter sort of worm shape next to the outline, and a darker tone. That kind of destroys the form for us, because form doesn't work that way in nature. So we want to darken those light things near the edge a little bit. So there's a gradation from darker to lighter. Even if it's very subtle, it instantly kind of transforms the feeling. And next to the shadows here, we'll just darken slightly. Actually, when you're working in an area this dark, maybe it's better just to switch to an H or even the HB, which is what I will be using. You can just sort of redefine this outline a little bit before softening again. So I figured I will leave this area alone now. This kind of neck and trapezius area I will move here, so you can see a bit of the darker stuff being worked as well. So now I'll just kind of pick out the shape again with the kneaded eraser. Try to match this shape that I've, you know, drawn in a couple of times already. We've been darkening things and sort of working with the stump in an imprecise way, so it's good to sort of readdress things here and there. And you see the correction took me like, what, 10 seconds. And now we just sort of tackle the transitions again. This area super soft overall. Also the shape is kind of more pointy towards the end here, so I'll just try to do that. Now it's a bit of a more pointy light shape over there. Just soften it slightly, you know. Softening can also happen in the shadows, you know, if you have a very dark tone next to it. I don't know, it's kind of pushing the limits of the camera work here, but there's a sort of darker line on the shadow going right here. Then there's something lighter, there's a darker line as well. Maybe this darker line is kind of creating a sense of sharpness that we don't want, so let's just break it apart with the kneaded eraser. So basically, when you're dot picking like this, literally picking out dots. You always want to think, you know, is it something I want to lighten or something I want to darken? Otherwise, you're just going to end up with frustration. You know, you might be trying to soften something like forever and it just never works. But the problem is maybe on the shadow side when you've been working on the light transition side. And, you know, it's never going to fix itself like that. So always just think, you know, before you make these things. It's pretty intuitive for me at this point because I've been doing this for a couple of years now, but we're thinking this way, let's say. So it does take a bit of practice, but that's how we sort of analytically approach this stuff. Something that surprises a lot of people is how, you know, analytical drawing and painting is when they're not familiar with it, and it's more about thinking than, you know, sort of executing actually. Dexterity is a part of it, of course, but it's not like the main thing. There's people who say they can't draw or paint because they have a, you know, shaky hand, but that's not really a necessity. You can draw in different ways. You can use tools to steady your hand like I'm using here, and it's more about what you're making and the choices you make during that process that define sort of the artwork. So, and even when it's a technical process like this, you know, it still kind of revolves around making smart decisions. Well, maybe I've gone a bit dark, so let's just kind of pick out the light a little bit again on both these forms. Switching pencils, since I'm kind of working the lighter shape now, I can just soften the edges a little bit. And then I think I want to again soften the shadow shape actually. And maybe working on transitions like this, you know, you already practiced with the sphere. That's a great place to just kind of hone your skill for creating transitions. And if something's not working, then you probably need to sort of step back and sort of start looking for those splotchy shapes that are destroying the form. You know, the more refined you get, the more those things will distract when we're viewing it. So maybe the initial stage kind of looks even a little bit better than the next step, because, you know, you refine some things and then all of a sudden these splotches and white worms appear in your tones, and then you have to fill those in before it really becomes refined. Or that's how it feels, at least. So next up, let's work some of these transitions. I'm just trying to move forward here so we can actually create this work a bit more efficiently, you know, because I could honestly I could work this area quite a bit more, but this is more about demonstrating technique to you guys than me flexing on how, you know, nice of a finish I can make. Sort of proved that to myself already when I was a student, so maybe there's just something that's distracting me a little bit on this previous shape. Now that I started looking at another area, there was just some very dark lines on the other shape there. As you can see, the 2H hardly leaves a tone, you know, it just takes a lot of scrubbing, very, very lightly, of course, I'm working here, but to kind of achieve a very subtle tone here. I'm sort of hatching with barely visible pencil marks to create the sort of turning bottom kind of, well, more vertical sort of plane of that muscle that's turning away from us. So So a big part of this stage is just looking where to soften things, basically. like ideally you have everything in the right value, the right shape, you know. We're not robots, of course, but that's something, you know, that we kind of strive for in the previous stages, and then our job is just to soften things to the right extent afterwards. Just cleaning up that edge a little bit. Maybe the outline is now a little bit too sort of pointy over there, so let's just smooth that out a little bit. Maybe here is a little bit of over modeling that I'm seeing. It kind of is a bit darker here where there on the reference it's quite light. There's barely any modeling on the edge there. So let's push that back a little bit. Keep our lights clean. Just work a tiny transition in here. So perhaps I need to fix this shape a little bit first. I think it's a little too light, so let's just tone it in a little bit more. Aiming for those lighter squigglies in the middle, you know, if those are sort of destroying the shape. And these shapes are not going to be perfect. I know it already, but well, on any of these rendering steps, but this is now more about showing you how to make these transitions than anything else. Now the tones are, you know, the contrast is more or less there. It's not like as contrasty as on the other image there that we're using for reference, but let's just push it a little bit more before we start doing the transitions really. So at least have some kind of darker stuff in here. It really makes a difference, you know, if the form is lighter against the white, it'll sort of feel like a very small undulation of the surface. If there's a bit more contrast, it feels more like a bulging muscle, you know. So it does have an impact. The more contrast, the more round it will seem. Well, yeah, and the more abrupt the transition, of course. Now something that's making this feel a bit too sharp and abrupt, I feel like, is the smaller dark marks in here that need to be sort of softened or broken up at least a little bit. There's sort of a dark line going vertically before in there. There's a small white spot left by the eraser, so let's just poke that out so it's not distracting, and then we can retry the transition here. I want it to be quite soft. So basically just go right next to the darker stuff first, and then from there just see if you can find some light things to tone down a little bit to make it more soft. And the transition is a little bit too long now. This is kind of a thin shape fading into the paper very quickly, so let's just, you know, push it back a little bit. Maybe this is a case where we can actually use this mono zero a little bit as well, kind of very lightly touching the surface. You can sort of create a transition as well. Okay, it's much closer now. The difference between the mono zero and the kneaded eraser many times is the kneaded eraser only really needs a contact to lift things off, and the mono zero you can apply different amounts of pressure to sort of create different amounts of lifting the pigment. So you can use this as a softening tool as well. The 2H still feels very sharp, but yeah, just take care to work with sharp pencils at this point. That is quite important here. Since we're working so small, if you have a dull point in the rendering stage, if you want to color in some very, you know, small light line like this, for example, there's this kind of paper texture crevice over here that is lighter. You obviously can't have a large point if it doesn't even fit into the crack of the paper there. So yeah, you can go as micro as you can and really push this project, but I'm gonna have a break now. One example of this, like how one can really take this rendering as far as we can. We had a student in the academy who actually worked super long on his projects, I guess there was no financial pressure, but yeah, he actually dot picked to that extent where the paper texture started to be, you know, distracting. So basically every crack and crevice of the paper texture in these areas was filled or dot picked to, you know, perfection basically. So that's a bit excessive. It's, you know, I don't feel it's necessary. It's not really making you a better artist at that point anymore. So, you know, keep the purpose in mind. All right, back to it. So during every break, I recommend you sharpen your pencils, you know, get them to a nice point. So you don't have to worry about dull pencils when working. So I would say we've wrapped this area up. Maybe there's a couple more refinements we want to do, just a little bit. This is the thing where you come back from a break and you just see some things that distract you a little bit too much. So you have to go and address those. Okay, so maybe we move forward from there. I guess the logical place to carry on next would be this area and transitions. So let's just hop in there. So first we just want to look again, you know, if the tones are correct, if we feel like everything is ready to work. I think so. So maybe let's start from this area here, which is, you know, pretty nice looking already. We don't really have to touch it too much. Just maybe soften some things towards the lights. I really am just softening things by hatching with the 2H pencil. And when you're hatching things, you know, adding things towards the light, just keep in mind that the shape might change, so check. And yeah, maybe the issue here is that I'm pushing things towards the light, so either we soften with this, it's actually looking better, but might be that we have to, you know, soften the edge with the eraser first and then push things out with the pencil again so that we get the right shape with the right transition at the end. So I don't know if that's very clear as I stated, but you know, point being, we don't only push things towards the light, you know, with this pencil adding tone. We have to also keep in mind that we might have to work towards the darker stuff. So maybe that's a bit more clear. But you know, it's pretty simple to just first go in and soften the edges at least, and then see, you know, what's working and what's not working. This isn't a terribly soft edge, but there is a distinct turning to it, so let's just apply that turning first and see how we're doing. And do keep in mind this edge isn't, you know, exactly razor sharp anywhere, and it's not super soft anywhere, but there is a little bit of variation. Maybe it comes a bit softer towards the down facing plane over here, and it's a bit sharper over here, so we can actually just even out and sharpen this a little bit towards here. It is still soft, you know, it's not razor sharp over there, but we can look for a distinct difference in the edge characteristics in these different places. This is kind of rendering the shadows, so we don't really want to do that too much, but we just want to make sure the edge of the shadow is correct. Okay, well, this is honestly looking pretty good, so I'm just gonna soften things a little bit here in the transition area. I just want to reiterate sort of everyone can see sort of the form, because that's no like magic trick, it's just how the eye perceives things. So when we draw something and there is form happening, you can see, you know, things sort of turning and moving. Just make sure you sort of match the feeling, how things go, you know. If you feel like this is too narrow and sort of too much of a pit in there, then, you know, you have to maybe darken this tone in the middle to reduce the contrast and sort of lessen that effect. Maybe that works. Yeah, and just try to keep comparing all the time. That's also very important in this stage. We don't want to just kind of hone in on this drawing and just soften everything. That's a way to, I guess, make it that look a bit nicer, but it's really not the goal. The goal is both to make it look nice and more accurate at the same time. I'm not going crazy with the accuracy in this case though, so bear with me. I think it's, you know, pretty good. This area for me is looking a little bit unrefined in terms of, you know, just having a lot of these kind of paper white squigglies going, so I'll just fill those in a little bit. Yeah, if you want to really like look into this dot picking stuff, I have the video on refining charcoal drawing, so you can check that out. It's just me working on a very small area, trying to smooth it out. It's not perfect as a result, but you get the idea of how it happens. Maybe a bit better because it's a bit more zoomed in. You can actually see the small stuff happening. So the reason I'm not zooming in for this now is so you can get the full time lapse later on. So you can just kind of follow along that one as well. You can get the big picture of what we've been working on here. I think I will offer you perhaps the very cut down version with the talking in, and then I will offer you the time-lapse version so you can see everything happening, but maybe not in real time. There is an option on YouTube to slow things down as well, so you can of course do that with the time-lapse as well, but maybe this is the area where I need to actually kind of nudge it a little bit softer with this first, and then readdress the transitions with the pencil. Otherwise I feel like these tones will kind of end up too far to the right. If you feel like things aren't transitioning well, I recommend you check that there's no like light lines or dark lines kind of breaking the illusion of turning. And after that, if it's still not working, then just, you know, decide if you need to actually lighten things or darken things. That's a pretty good procedure for working this stage. The reason I'm going into with the eraser here first is because I felt this was maybe a little bit too dark over here, so over here there's kind of small lighter plane as well, so let's just put that in. So yeah, I just kind of hopped into this area, but maybe I should actually just get back here because I can see that this really isn't finished yet. Here's where the shadow from the right is getting a bit annoying because even I can't really see too well what I'm working on. But hey, we gotta make do with what we got, you know. If you've only got a bedroom with a single ceiling light, then that's what we're gonna work with. Maybe if it gets to the stage where you really wanna take it seriously, then you can invest in a studio light bulb of some kind. I'll make a little video on my studio setup as well, so you can sort of get some ideas. Coming back to this area, I feel there's a couple dark spots that are, you know, bothering me a little bit. Earlier I was saying, you know, there's some lighter worms that are bothering me, which was true, but you know, filling in those light worms, then suddenly the dark spots appear, and